No one in the world suspects that at a moment's notice, I can become mighty Green Lantern with my amazing powering and invincible green beam. Golly, what a feeling it is. This was 1960, the superhero on top of the world. But 10 years later, in 1970, we have this image of the same superhero getting tunked on the head by a can of beans. How did we go from his fellow green superhero, Green Arrow, looking like this in 1960, to looking like this 11 years later, 1971? How did we go from superheroes who looked up to science and technology in the Kennedy years in the early 60s to this symbol representing the death of the 60s 10 years later? We're dealing with symbols of superheroes. Superheroes in the early 60s who became super anti-heroes by the end of the 60s. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Superheroes in the 60s, Comics and Counterculture. Artist and a comic historian, lover of American pop culture, and welcome to my home. There's an entire history of Batman just in these figures that I've assembled. You have the Batman model kit from 1964. Here's the Batman of the animated series from the early 90s. Here's Robin first introduced, more of an imp. And then in the 1970s, that's what he looked like then. So the things in my apartment also show the history of how these characters developed over time. I've been drawing since I was 3 years old, and then in summer camp, and when I was 5 or 6, I was turned on to comic books that were in the bunks. Along with the Archies and Bettys and Veronicas, they were superheroes. And started drawing from looking at the comics and reading the comics, and they really taught me really everything I know about art, even though I went to a great art school and studied with great artists. What we're going to do is the actual nuts and bolts, old-fashioned, old-school 20th century drawing. It's a little bit of magic. Okay, with this drawing of Iron Man, I took my pencil drawing and I scanned it into the computer and I printed it out, but in reverse of the way I penciled it. So that now I'm going to flip it over on the light table, and now on this side of the paper I'm going to ink it with black line and make those decisions of what to ink and how thick the line should be and where you should commit to black. Okay, so there's the logo for the show. I scanned this ink drawing in, and that's how we got this drawing here. And you can see as I pull off these different layers, you can see all the different characters that I have here. There's your Batman in the background, Iron Man, Ares. My photo reference for him, picture of Brad Pitt from the movie. The shield is from another source, and the sword is from a third source. My Hercules is basically, I use Arnold Schwarzenegger. We have Zeus, which I based on the classic Zeus from Fantasia, the Walt Disney film. And that's basically how I'm going to create this composited image. I have a lot of work cut out for me. I have to finish inking these drawings and scan them in and color them. But thanks for coming. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. I'll see you in the funny pages. The funny pages. The 60s didn't really begin at the turn of the decade. Decades are never as easy as that. The 60s, as we know them, really began with the Kennedy assassination in 1963. That set off the decade that even you young people know of as the 60s. Images that you've seen in pop culture, the riots, the race riots, the Vietnam War demonstrations, the Pulitzer Prize winning photographs like this one. Everybody's seen this one, the demonstration against the Vietnam War. Of course, the assassinations of the 60s. They did a number on America, on the whole decade, in fact. Here's Life magazine's end of the 60s celebration. But what the 60s did to the concept of heroes, and eventually superheroes, is that before the 60s, the hero in American culture was basically the cowboy, as emblemized by John Wayne. But by the end of the 60s, the cowboy, the outlaw, becomes the hero. 1967, Bonnie and Clyde was the groundbreaking film. 1969, you have Butch Cassidy, the Sundance Kid. The same year, Midnight Cowboy. You essentially have the cowboy, the outlaw, as the hero. You have the motorcycle riders of Easy Rider. There, even though they're drug addicts and drug dealers, they become the heroes. Even the Diffident Docks of MASH, though set in the Korean War, was really more of a Vietnam War parable. They were heroic. So in the 60s, the establishment superheroes like Superman, Flash, and Green Lantern were essentially replaced by the super anti-heroes, Spider-Man, Doctor Strange, and of course Green Arrow. And that's why I have this image as the image of this lecture. Now, when you're dealing with any comic book history lecture, it always begins with Superman. But what most people don't realize is that when Superman started, this was the title of the backup story in Superman #1. Superman really began as a champion of the underclass, of the oppressed. So in the very first issue of Superman Action Comics, 1938, if you look at the panel on the lower left, and we blow it up, we see right in the beginning, champion of the oppressed, the physical moral, that's the key word. And that the very early stories, this particular one about universal peace, Superman is taking characters who in the late 30s were representing Hitler and Mussolini, but weren't named, and his idea of solving world peace was to actually bring the pillars down upon them, or let them fight it out amongst themselves. A couple years later, when World War II actually started, Superman would be doing symbolic images like this, but people wanted to know, why isn't Superman actually fighting World War II, as if a fictional character can fight? But Look magazine in 1940 went to Siegel and Schuster and hired them to do a 2-page story, for some reason printed in this bizarre red and black duotone, essentially how Superman would end the war. And here's a blown up panel that DC Comics later reprinted in color. And here he's actually using Hitler. So right from the beginning, Superman and the superheroes are teaming up with American ideology, theoretically to fight the war. But this is an actual photograph of a B-52 bomber. And there is Superman, relatively a new character, emblazoned on the side of the bomber, probably taken from this image promoting the Superman cartoons by Max Fleischer, who did the Popeye cartoons. Even in the comic books themselves, DC Comics was reaching out to, young people who were reading the comics to become members of this Superman club that would promote very all-American ideals. Mental health, strictly linked with physical health. Do the right thing, help others, keep your conscience clear. That's super living. Or how about this one? There's nothing like cereals, milk, and fruit to give you that Superman energy. In fact, right from the beginning, Superman does an all-American thing. He starts selling products. And that's why, by the mid-40s, an image like this is really what Superman stood for, what everybody kind of knows about Superman. Truth, justice, and the American way. Of course, after Batman, the next great superhero is basically Captain America, representing a 20th century version, really, of the mythological Uncle Sam, except updated into the 20th century with a mask and costume. When he's punching Hitler here, anybody read Cavalier and Clay, this is the wraparound dust cover, because the whole book is a roman à clef about the early 1940s, so you can see how they took from that image. And right away, comic books are absorbed by the American kids, and they're doing things like this right from the beginning. So if you think dressing up at Comic-Con is relatively new, they were doing it in 1940. After World War II starts, everybody's fighting the war. All superheroes are taking the lead from Superman and basically going to war. So even Batman's in a Jeep. Wonder Woman, when she debuts, is fighting the Jap-Nazi rats, as they were called. Over at the early Timely Comics, which became Marvel, you have the Human Torch fighting World War II, the Submariner. Even Captain Marvel is teaming up with Uncle Sam, who of course they made into his own comic book character, to help fight the war. There's the Flash fighting, you know, I don't know, are those Japanazis? Are those Japanazis? They look like Italians. I don't know, is that racist? Maybe. Anyway, here's Green Lantern with his sidekick, Doiby Dickles. Don't ask me where that came from. And of course, all the DC superheroes eventually team up. Even the word American is so tied in with superheroes, and of course, they all team up to form the first supergroup, which was the Justice Society of America. So